and loved here in America. Here are the Beatles.
I need somebody help, not just anybody help. You know I need someone.
They were the biggest band in history, four friends from Liverpool adored by millions. But behind the fame, George Harrison's patience was pushed to the breaking point. Quiet and thoughtful, he spent years watching his songs ignored, his talent dismissed, and his voice silenced. The studio, once a place of creation, had become a battlefield, and one bandmate controlled it all. By 1969, George couldn't take it anymore. He snapped, stormed out, and quit the Beatles. But walking away wasn't enough. The resentment lingered, burning for decades. Today, we reveal the shocking truth. The Beatle George Harrison hated more than anyone, and the moment that finally let go of a lifetime of anger.
So
some people can't understand that, because Beatles was such a big deal. They can't understand why we should actually enjoy splitting up.
Before fame and screaming fans, George Harrison was learning a lesson that would follow him for decades. Talent alone wasn't enough to be heard. Liverpool in the mid-1950s wasn't a city you'd call glamorous. Streets were still scarred from wartime bombings, chimneys coughed out smoke, and the air smelled faintly of coal. But for a boy like George Harrison, the gray landscape could disappear the second he picked up a guitar. He carried that love everywhere, to school, to the corner shop, even onto the rickety double-decker bus that rattled through the city each morning. One day, somewhere between the chatter of schoolmates and the hum of the engine, George found himself sitting near Paul McCartney. Paul was a year older, more confident, and already had the swagger of someone who believed music could take him places. The two started talking about the only thing that mattered to them: the raw electric pulse of American rock and roll. Carl Perkins, Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley. They didn't just admire those artists. They studied them, dreamed about them, imagined themselves trading licks on stage. By 1958, their friendship had turned into something bigger. Paul, by then a member of John Lennon's skiffle group The Quarrymen, saw a spark in George that most would have missed. He convinced John to give this 15-year-old a chance, even though John thought he was just a kid tagging along. The audition wasn't in a studio or on a stage. It was on the upper deck of a late-night bus. Outside, Liverpool's street lamps blurred in the dark. Inside, George cradled his guitar and launched into Raunchy, a tricky instrumental hit of the time. His fingers moved fast and clean, every note sharp, confident, and alive. By the end, even John, famously hard to impress, was grinning. That performance got George into The Quarrymen. It was Paul's recommendation that opened the door for him. A moment of loyalty and faith between friends.
Because we got something more to work on now.
Before the world saw them as legends, the Beatles already had an invisible pecking order, and it wasn't hard to figure out who sat at the top. But what most fans don't realize is that this pecking order would push George Harrison to his breaking point.
I thought the Stones wrote that one themselves.
No, we wrote that one ourselves.
John Lennon and Paul McCartney were the undisputed kings of the castle. They wrote most of the songs, stood front and center on stage, and commanded the headlines. Their creative partnership was so dominant that, to the outside world, they were the Beatles. And then, there was George Harrison. George wasn't just a background player. His guitar work was essential to the band's sound. From the shimmering chords in A Hard Day's Night to the iconic opening riff of Day Tripper, his touch was everywhere. But in the early years, that role came with a silent condition. He was the lead guitarist, not the lead voice. His job was to add the perfect texture to John and Paul's ideas, not to shape the vision himself. At first, It didn't bother him. In the sweaty, neon-lit clubs of Hamburg in the early 1960s, the four of them, John, Paul, George, and drummer Pete Best, later replaced by Ringo Starr, were like brothers in battle. They played marathon sets night after night, living in cramped quarters, sharing cheap meals, and chasing the same dream. Back then, the hierarchy was more like an inside joke. Everyone knew John and Paul were in charge, but there was no reason to question it. But as the fame machine roared into overdrive, things began to change. By the mid-60s, the Beatles weren't just popular. They were a global obsession. Screaming fans drowned out their concerts. Paparazzi chased them through airports. They couldn't walk down a street without causing chaos. Inside that pressure cooker, Paul McCartney's natural perfectionism started to morph into something more intense. Paul often came into Abbey Road Studios with a song already fully formed in his head. Not just the melody, he had the bass line, the drum fills, and yes, even the guitar parts mapped out. To him, it was efficiency. To George, it felt like being told how to play his own instrument. And this was the problem. George wasn't the same shy teenager who joined the band years earlier. By now, he'd grown into a skilled, confident musician with ideas of his own. But the more he tried to bring those ideas forward, the more they were sidelined in favor of Lennon-McCartney songs. It wasn't that Paul meant to undermine him. Paul was chasing perfection, obsessed with making each track as good as humanly possible. But in doing so, he unintentionally tightened the creative leash around George's neck. The studio, supposed to be a place of freedom and experimentation, was becoming a space where George had to fight just to be heard. And that fight was about to get a lot louder. By the mid-1960s, George Harrison was no longer the shy teenager from Liverpool, quietly strumming his guitar in the shadow of John and Paul. He had grown into a musician with a voice of his own, and that voice was finally starting to break through in the songs he wrote. These weren't just pleasant B-sides or throwaway album tracks. They were sharp, intelligent, and every bit as memorable as anything his bandmates were putting out. Take Taxman in 1966, a punchy, biting opener to Revolver that took a jab at Britain's punishing tax rates. It was witty, politically charged, and bold, proof that George could carry a song just as confidently as Lennon or McCartney. Or If I Needed Someone, with its jangly, chiming guitar lines inspired by the Byrds, showing his knack for blending folk rock textures with pop melodies. These songs weren't accidents. They were carefully crafted statements from a man who was ready to stand on equal footing. But here was the problem. Getting those songs onto a Beatles album was a battle every single time. George would watch as John and Paul filled record after record with their work, sometimes squeezing in only one or two of his songs. He would later admit how exhausting it was to sit through endless run-throughs of Paul's material, offering his guitar parts and arrangements, only to have Paul reluctantly glance at his songs as if they were optional extras. It wasn't just disappointing, it was humiliating. And it wasn't only about songwriting. The same dynamic seeped into the way the Beatles recorded music. George's guitar work, subtle, precise, and full of emotional weight, was often micromanaged to the point of suffocation. Paul, with his laser-focused perfectionism, would tell George exactly how to play a solo, down to the phrasing of each note, even if the song wasn't one of Paul's own. The sessions could become tense and awkward, especially when George felt his own instincts were being ignored in favor of Paul's blueprint. Some moments cut even deeper. On Another Girl, released in 1965, Paul didn't just tell George what to play. He simply picked up the guitar and played the lead part himself. No discussion, no collaboration. Just a silent decision that said, "I don't need you here." For someone as proud and skilled as George, that was more than a creative disagreement. It was a slap in the face. All of this tension built up quietly, but you can hear it in the records if you know where to listen. The moments where George is playing is brilliant yet strangely restrained, as if he's holding back something he wasn't allowed to release. And then came a day in 1968 inside the studio when the frustration stopped simmering in the background. Something happened during the recording of one of the Beatles' biggest songs. An exchange so sharp, so public, that it made everyone in the room fall silent. What exactly was said that day? Why did it leave George more certain than ever that his voice in the Beatles didn't matter? And could this moment have been the beginning of the end for the band's unity?
Do you think you might have been the most anxious of the four to get out? I get that impression from reading about it.
Maybe, yeah.
By the late 1960s, cracks in the Beatles' unity were widening, and one moment in 1968 would leave a scar that never quite healed. It happened during the recording of Hey Jude, a song Paul McCartney had poured his heart into. It wasn't just another single to him. It was a sweeping anthem of comfort, hope, and slow-building emotional release. As the band shaped the arrangement in the studio, George Harrison, ever the understated craftsman, began weaving a delicate guitar phrase between Paul's vocal lines. It was a subtle call and response idea, something he believed would give the track an extra shimmer. But before it could take flight, Paul abruptly stopped him. In front of the band, the crew, and anyone else within earshot, he shot the idea down cold. No discussion, no gentle redirection, just a firm, public no. From Paul's side, it was about protecting the purity of his vision. He wanted the focus locked on the vocals, piano, and that now iconic fade out, not tangled up in extra guitar flourishes, but for George, it was a gut punch. In that moment, he didn't feel like an equal partner in the world's biggest band. He felt like a sideman, someone hired to play what he was told, nothing more. Pattie Boyd, George's wife at the time, later recalled how he'd come home after those sessions, angry, deflated, and creatively drained. The joy of making music with his friends was being replaced by frustration, and Hey Jude wasn't just another disagreement. It became a symbol of something deeper, a growing belief that his contributions were undervalued and unwanted. What George didn't know was that this wasn't the last time tensions would boil over. Just a few months later, under the cold January skies of 1969, the situation would explode in a way no one could walk back. January of 1969 was supposed to be a new dawn for the Beatles. Instead, it became the month that almost broke them for good. The band had agreed to film a documentary called Get Back, the idea being simple and almost romantic. Strip away the studio tricks, write songs the old-fashioned way, and end it all with a live performance. It sounded like a way to recapture the magic that had made them four young lads from Liverpool taking on the world. But the reality was far from magical. Instead of the warmth of Abbey Road, they found themselves shivering inside Twickenham Film Studios, a cavernous, echoing space that felt more like a warehouse than a creative sanctuary. It was winter in London. The heaters never quite did their job, and the ever-present cameras were rolling from morning to night. Every awkward glance, every sigh, every disagreement was caught on tape, and tensions, already smoldering beneath the surface, began to catch fire. For George Harrison, the timing couldn't have been worse. He had just come back from an inspiring trip to America, where he'd spent time with Bob Dylan and the band in Woodstock. There, music had felt alive again. Informal jam sessions, mutual respect, a sense that everyone's voice mattered. He'd returned to England with fresh ideas, only to walk straight back into a familiar hierarchy where Paul McCartney often took the reins, sometimes without leaving much room for others to steer. The breaking point came during a rehearsal for two of us. With cameras rolling, Paul started instructing George on exactly what and what not to play. To George, it wasn't just about that one guitar part. It was years of feeling like the junior partner in a band where he had grown into so much more. His response wasn't loud or explosive. It was sharper than that. With an icy calm, he said he'd play whatever Paul wanted, or nothing at all. In that moment, the frustration of years was laid bare for all to see. Just days later, on January 10th, George arrived, quietly told the others he was leaving, and walked out. No shouting, no drama, just a parting line. "See you round the clubs." John Lennon's first reaction? Suggesting they call Eric Clapton. What George did next would surprise even the people who knew him best, and it came with the sting of a wah-wah headache. George went home, away from the cameras and the arguments, and immediately channeled his toxic cocktail of anger, relief, and frustration into his art. He wrote a new song, giving it a title that perfectly encapsulated his feelings: Wah Wah. The song was a direct, unfiltered complaint about the suffocating headache of clashing egos, the noise of constant criticism, and the "you're giving me a wah-wah" pain of the band's toxic environment. He would eventually return to the group 12 days later, but his return came with conditions. He refused to go back to the cold film studio, forcing the band to abandon the original documentary concept and relocate to the more intimate confines of their own new Apple studio. The Beatles would go on to make one more masterpiece, Abbey Road, but the damage was done. The spirit of the band was effectively broken. George's walkout was the beginning of the end.
And not knowing whether I was going to continue in music, that was kind of depressing.
When the Beatles' breakup became official in the spring of 1970, most of the world reacted with disbelief and heartbreak. Headlines screamed about the end of an era, fans wept, and radio stations played Beatles songs on repeat as if clinging to a fading dream. But for George Harrison, it wasn't just an ending, it was an escape. After more than a decade of living in the shadows of John Lennon and Paul McCartney's songwriting partnership, he finally felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The cage door had swung wide open, and inside George's head was a vault of songs he had been forced to store away for years. Some of these songs had been written as far back as 1966. Isn't It a Pity, for example, had been rejected during multiple Beatles sessions, and All Things Must Pass had been overlooked despite its haunting beauty. Dozens more, melodies, lyrics, and arrangements had never made it past the gatekeepers of Lennon-McCartney. Now, nothing was stopping him from emptying that vault. George didn't enter the studio as a hesitant first-time solo artist. He walked in like a man who had been quietly sharpening his tools, waiting for the day he could finally build something of his own. The result was All Things Must Pass, a monumental triple album recorded at EMI's Abbey Road Studios and produced with Phil Spector, who brought his signature wall of sound to the project. This wasn't a cautious debut. It was a tidal wave of music. Spirituality flowed through tracks like My Sweet Lord and Beware of Darkness, while raw emotion pulsed through Wah Wah and Isn't It a Pity. When the album hit the shelves in November 1970, it didn't just sell well, it dominated. All Things Must Pass shot to #1 around the globe, and My Sweet Lord became the first solo single by an ex-Beatle to reach #1 in both the United Kingdom and the United States. The achievement wasn't just commercial, it was deeply personal. For George, it was proof that he wasn't just the quiet one. He was an artist of equal standing, capable of shaping the musical world on his own terms. But success didn't wash away old resentments overnight. The bitterness lingered, sometimes spilling into public moments. In 1971, George stood beside John Lennon in the studio as John recorded his infamous attack on Paul McCartney, "How Do You Sleep?" George's slide guitar solo cut through the song like a blade, a musical reminder that his loyalties, at least then, were not with Paul. For years afterward, George and Paul's relationship remained strained, with George occasionally taking sly jabs in interviews. He admitted that being sidelined for so long had damaged his confidence in ways he was still working to undo. The quiet Beatle had found his voice, but the echo of being silent still haunted him. And then, just when time seemed to be softening those hard edges, a tragedy in December 1980 would change everything and bring the surviving Beatles face to face with what really mattered.
Shot, and so that drove me crazy. But you think he's been shot, he's shot in the arm, shot in the leg, and then they came back and they said he's dead.
Time has a way of softening old wounds, but for George Harrison and his former bandmates, the true turning point came in December 1980 with a tragedy no one could have prepared for. John Lennon, their friend, brother-in-arms, and sometimes rival, was shot and killed outside his New York apartment. The world reeled in shock, but for Paul, George, and Ringo, the pain was intensely personal. The loss forced them to look at their own lives, their regrets, and the fleeting nature of friendship. For George, the shock stirred something deep. He reached out to Paul in small, meaningful ways. One of the first signs of thawing came with George's tribute to John, All Those Years Ago, released in 1981. Paul and his wife Linda lent backing vocals, a quiet but powerful gesture that said, without words, "We're still here, together, honoring him." It was a tentative step, but it mattered. The real reunion, though, came more than a decade later with the Anthology Project in the mid-1990s. For the first time in over 20 years, George, Paul, and Ringo sat down to tell their story, to dig through old demos, and even record new music based on John's unfinished songs. The sessions weren't always smooth, old arguments flared up, and the ghosts of past rivalries lingered. But something had changed. Age, experience, and the weight of shared history brought perspective. They could laugh at the fights that once seemed world-ending and finally appreciate the bond that had made them legends. In those sessions, George found a sense of closure. Reconciliation wasn't instant, but it was real. Through grief, reflection, and the slow work of repairing trust, the surviving Beatles reclaimed a piece of what they had lost, not the past itself, but the friendship at the heart of it. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for thrilling stories. Thanks for watching.